of skeletons in their closets, and it explains their actions and inactions far more satisfactorily than formal history may do. Folklore can very seldom be documented. If it could be, then it would be history. Folklore is often exaggerated. Sometimes it's made up out of whole cloth. I've been guilty of a little of that. Often it's derived from the family or community past, filtered through the prism of individual interpretations and sometimes creative memories. But even when it violates the facts, it usually reflects truth, the true spirit, the true temper of a time, a person, or place. It tends to flesh out the bones of history and give life to people and events. It's a proven fact of history that the siege of the Alamo lasted 13 days, that the Alamo fell on March the 6th, 1836. That much we know beyond question. It's folklore that William Barrett Travis drew a line with his sword and invited all who wanted to stay and fight to step across that line with him. It's folklore that Jim Bowie, injured and lying on his cot, asked that that cot be carried across the line. Whether or not these incidents really happened, they illustrate the spirit of the times and those men. They make Travis and Bowie and the rest live for us. It's within the character of these men that the incident could have happened. So long as we recognize the difference between folklore and proven fact, the folklore is helpful in understanding our past and ourselves today. It sheds light that strict history never can. It helps explain the why and gives extra depth to the who. So then we come to the third facet of truth, and that's fiction. Now, I know that sounds like a contradiction in terms, but maybe it's not. I'm thoroughly enamored of history and folklore, and I have the greatest respect for both. But it's in the realm of fiction that I've chosen to work the most. Fiction can fill in the blank spots left by both history and folklore. By making fictional characters walk and talk, a writer can bring a situation, a time, a place, a set of people to life. Through them, he or she can make the realities of history more understandable, more human, and more relevant to our lives today. The fiction writer can show how the past affects the present and may very well affect the future. Fiction, though it's not literally factual, can illuminate history and bring it within our grasp. It can give it a breath and a heartbeat. As a youngster, I was an avid reader. My mother encouraged that. I read everything I could get my hands on. If I couldn't get anything else, I'd read the labels on cans and coffee and so forth in the kitchen. The first book I ever owned was Treasure Island. Our teacher had begun reading it to us in the daily reading class, reading hour, and I got so caught up in it that I couldn't wait to see how it all came out. I badgered my mother into ordering a copy of it from Sears Roebuck. The unholy price of 49 cents. Hardcover. But I still have that book. We had a fairly small library in the Crane schools where I went. I devoured it. I read all the standard childhood classics, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, Hans Brinker, Gulliver's Travels. I have to confess that Gulliver's Travels threw me just a little. I didn't know anything about English or Irish history at the time, or about the uses of irony to make a point. So the thought of raising babies, Irish babies, to feed to the English rich really appalled me. It was much later before I understood that Swift was using ironic fiction to illustrate a truth. Though I read a variety of subject matter, what I always liked best and kept coming back to was things about Texas and the West. I related to that because it reflected the life I saw around me every day. I grew up on a ranch where my father was a foreman. I was around cowboys all the time. I listened to their stories and absorbed the folklore of the range. I was spellbound by J. Frank Dobie, the great Texas folklorist. His book, The Longhorns, gave me a feeling for the old-time cattle industry and the cowboy that stays with me to this day. Nearly all the relatives, my relatives on my father's side, were cattle people. They were cowboys and ranchers. I realized very early in my life that there was something a little different about them. On my mother's side, the men worked in the oil fields, so that kind of life was also part of my early experience. Crane was an oil patch town, so I absorbed a great deal of oil field folklore, though far less has ever been written about that life than about the cattle industry. I managed finally to write one oil field novel. It was called Honor at Daybreak, so I finally worked off that part of my cultural heritage. As a boy, I read and loved the great horse stories by Will James, such as Smokey, Sand, and Scorpion. These never made any pretense at being anything other than fiction, though they reflected a lifestyle the author knew extremely well. They reflected a reality, at least, as he saw that reality through his rose-tinted glasses. Will James added another dimension to the cowboys I'd known all my life. Most of them never were quite as handsome, and certainly the horses were never as pretty as his. Some of them were probably about as mean. Still another book in the school library taught me a great deal about cow people. It was Paul I. Wellman's The Trampling Herd, a nonfiction history of the American cattle industry from the time of Columbus's second voyage through the era of the great cattle drives and to the end of the open range period. I read other great writers, fiction and nonfiction, on the subject, including Charlie Siringo, Eugene Manlove Rhodes, and Stuart Edward White. I won't try to kid you that all my reading was on that plane. I once knew the plot of every book Zane Grey ever wrote. I used to wait until the corner drugstore tore the covers off the previous week's pulp magazines and sent them back in for a rebate, and then I could buy them for a nickel instead of a dime. I was thoroughly familiar with Walt Coburn, William Colt MacDonald, Max Brand, and other pulp writers of that day. There's no telling how many hundreds of hours I spent reading material that my teachers dismissed as trash. But I don't begrudge 1 minute of it. I don't believe any of it was really wasted. Number one, it taught me to read and to love reading. Number two, it fired my imagination. Number three, whatever the merits or demerits in the manner in which it reflected history, it gave me a deep and abiding interest in real history, an interest I might never have acquired had I devoted myself strictly to formal history and materials my teachers considered, quote, good literature. Because I love so much to read fiction, it was natural that I turned to trying to write it. I started at an early age, often writing stories at times when I was supposed to be studying other subjects. English was always my long suit. I won most of the spelling bees, none of the ball games. This was at a time when in an oil patch town like Crane, a boy who excelled in English and won spelling bees was automatically suspect. But all those grand stories by Dobie and James and Gray would run through my head and fire me up to write stories of my own out of my imagination. I couldn't get fired up over compound fractions and carrying pi to the fourth power. It just never, somehow it never quite registered. Because there were books in the library I hadn't gotten around to yet, and arithmetic was an unwelcome distraction that kept me away from them. But as I got older, I became more selective about what I read. I became more critical. In the field of the Western, I learned that some writers did honest stories with both feet planted firmly on facts, and others didn't know whether cows slept in caves or roosted in trees. think my first serious